There's a number buried in your DNA that most people will never learn. It is not your age, not your blood type, not even your ancestry percentage from some mail-in test. It is a date, a single point in time when every person who would ever live on Earth converged into one small group of ancestors. Geneticists call it the identical ancestors point. And when it was first calculated, it stunned even the researchers who found it, because the number was almost absurdly recent. Not 100,000 years ago, not 50,000. Somewhere between 5 and 15,000 years ago, a group of people existed from whom every single human being alive today descends. Every one of us. No exceptions. To understand how strange this is, you have to understand what scientists thought they knew about race and ancestry just a few decades ago. For most of the 20th century, the working assumption, encoded into law, medicine, and everyday language, was that humanity split cleanly into a handful of biological races, each with deep, separate roots stretching back tens of thousands of years. Skin color, skull shape, hair texture. These were treated as if they were the surface E markers of entirely different branches on the human tree. It felt intuitive. It felt like common sense. And it was almost completely wrong. The unraveling began quietly in the 1970s with a population geneticist named Richard Lewontin. He did something remarkably simple. He took the genetic data available at the time and asked a direct question: how much of human genetic variation exists between the traditional racial groups, and how much exists within them? The answer reshaped the field. Somewhere around 85% of human genetic variation exists within any single population, say among Han Chinese people or among Yoruba people in Nigeria. Only a small remainder separates those groups from each other. Two farmers from neighboring valleys in Papua New Guinea can carry more genetic difference between them than exists, on average, between a Japanese person and a Norwegian. Critics pushed back for years, arguing Lewontin's statistical approach missed patterns that clustering algorithms might reveal. And in a way, they were right. Later studies, using more sophisticated tools, did find that you can, with enough markers, computationally sort people into geographic clusters that loosely echo continents. But here is the detail that rarely makes it into the headlines. Those clusters are artifacts of where you draw your sample lines, not evidence of discrete ancient branches. Feed the algorithm a smoother, more continuous set of populations, from Senegal through Egypt, through Arabia, through India, and the clean boundaries dissolve into gradients. Race, at the genetic level, behaves less like a set of separate boxes and more like the shading on a very long ramp. So if the boxes were never really there, why do we see such striking physical differences walking down any city street? This is where the story becomes genuinely fascinating, because the answer involves some of the fastest evolutionary changes ever documented in any species. Consider skin pigmentation. Ancient DNA extracted from skeletons in Europe tells us that many hunter-gatherers who lived there 8,000 years ago had dark skin, dark hair, and, in a detail that startled researchers, strikingly blue eyes. Light skin, as we associate it with Northern Europe today, spread later, likely pushed by the arrival of farming, a diet lower in vitamin D from anemone, Hal sources, and the relentless selective pressure of weak, high-latitude sunlight. The genes involved, SLC24A5 among them, swept through European populations with a speed that population geneticists still find remarkable, among the strongest signals of recent natural selection ever detected in the human genome. Meanwhile, on the other side of the planet, a different story was unfolding entirely on its own. East Asian populations developed pale skin through largely different genetic machinery, different mutations, different genes, arriving independently at a broadly similar outcome. This is convergent evolution, the same phenomenon that gives ichthyosaurs and dolphins their similar torpedo-shaped bodies, despite one being a reptile and the other a mammal. Nature, faced with similar problems, sunlight in the north, heat near the equator, sometimes finds similar solutions through completely unrelated paths. It is a humbling detail, because it means that traits we once used to sort humanity into races were not even inherited from a shared source. They evolved separately more than once in a strange kind of biological echo. If pigmentation looks unstable across 10,000 years, what happens when you look at the deeper architecture of ancestry itself? This is where ancient DNA sequencing, a technology barely 2 decades old, rewired everything. When researchers first sequenced the genome of a farmer who lived in Anatolia 9,000 years ago, then compared it to hunter-gatherers who had lived across Europe for tens of thousands of years before, they discovered something uncomfortable for anyone attached to the idea of an unbroken ancient native population. The hunter-gatherers were almost entirely replaced, not gradually absorbed, largely displaced over the course of roughly 2,000 years, by incoming farmers carrying genetics, language, and agriculture from the Near East. Then, around 5,000 years ago, a third wave arrived. Herders from the Pontic stepped north of the Black Sea, writing a genetic and cultural transformation so significant that it may have introduced the ancestor of nearly every Indo-European language spoken today, from Hindi to Irish. Modern Europeans are not the descendants of one deep lineage. They are the layered residue of at least 3 population turnovers, each one arriving, mixing, and partially overwriting what came before, like sediment compressed into rock. This pattern of replacement, absorption, and remixing was not confined to Europe. In East Asia, genome studies of the Han Chinese population, often imagined from the outside as a single, ancient, unified group, reveal a deep north-south genetic divide, older than the empire itself, later stitched together through centuries of migration, conquest, and intermarriage under successive dynasties. In the Americas, geneticists tracing the ancestry of indigenous populations found something nobody expected, faint but unmistakable. Genetic echoes connecting some Amazonian groups to populations in Australia and Papua New Guinea, a signal researchers now call the population Y mystery. How genetic material related to Oceania ended up in South America thousands of years before any known contact between the regions remains one of the open puzzles of modern population genetics. Some researchers propose a now-vanished founding population that carried this ancestry across the Bering Land Bridge alongside, or before, the ancestors of most other Native Americans. Others urge caution, noting the signal is faint and could reflect an artifact of ancient population structure rather than a direct migration. Either way, the tidy story of a single, simple migration into the Americas no longer survives contact with the data. And then there is the number that started this story, the identical ancestors point. Mathematically, the logic is almost dizzying once you sit with it. Each person has 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, doubling every generation. Go back only 30 generations, roughly 900 years, and the math produces over 1 billion theoretical ancestor slots, far more people than existed on Earth at the time. The only way to resolve that contradiction is if many of those ancestor slots are filled by the same individuals, appearing again and again through different lines of descent. This is called pedigree collapse, and it means your family tree is not really a tree at all. It is closer to a dense, tangled net that folds back on itself constantly. Statisticians modeling human population history have proposed that if you go back far enough, roughly to a period estimated between 5,000 and 15,000 years ago, you reach a single generation in which every person alive today who has any living descendants is an ancestor of every person alive today, period. Not most people, not most populations, everyone. A farmer near the Yellow River, a herder on the steppe, a fisherman on the coast of what is now Peru. Only if their line survived to the present, you are their descendant. So is the person on the entirely opposite side of the planet from you. This does not mean humanity has no history of separation, movement, or divergence. Quite the opposite. Genetics has revealed migrations far more intricate than anyone imagined even 30 years ago. Waves of expansion out of Africa beginning somewhere around 60 to 70,000 years ago, subsequent branching into populations that would spend thousands of years isolated by oceans, mountains, and ice sheets, developing distinct languages, distinct cultures, distinct adaptations to entirely different worlds. The genetic story of humanity is not one of sameness erasing difference. It is one of divergence and reconvergence happening again and again, populations splitting apart for millennia, only to collide, mix, and split again somewhere else, on some other timescale. What the data dismantles is not human difference itself. To the idea that these differences ever sorted neatly into a small number of ancient, separate, hierarchical branches. There is one more layer to this story that rarely gets told, and it concerns the genes that do cluster by geography, because a small number genuinely do. The sickle cell trait concentrates in populations with ancestry from regions historically burdened by malaria, not only West Africa, but also parts of the Mediterranean, the Arabian Peninsula, and India, because the same evolutionary pressure appeared everywhere malaria did. Europeans and East African cattle herding groups in pockets of the Middle East, tracking not race but the deep. Cultural history of dairying itself, appearing independently, again through different mutations, wherever humans built their lives around herding animals. These are not fossils of ancient racial branches. They are fingerprints of specific environments and specific ways of living, stamped onto the genome wherever the same pressures existed, whether or not the populations involved ever knew of each other's existence. Which leaves us with an uncomfortable but strangely beautiful conclusion. The physical differences we notice first, skin tone, eye shape, hair texture, are also, on a genomic scale, the most recent, the most volatile, and the most superficial layer of what makes us who we are. They occupy a tiny fraction of the genome and were largely written in the last few thousand years, a blink of an eye CTA against 300,000 years of human existence. Underneath that thin, recent layer lies something far older and far more shared. A species that spent the overwhelming majority of its history as one interconnected, endlessly migrating, endlessly mixing population, splitting and rejoining like rivers across a landscape, until you and every stranger you will ever pass on the street turn out, if you trace the threads, back far enough to be standing on the same branch of the same family tree. Not metaphorically, genetically. The question science leaves us with is not whether we are e-connected. That part is now settled. The real question is what we choose to do with the knowledge that we always were.